is the first in the series of three for this year in 2025, hosted by Control Union. And this first one will be, or the title of this first one will be Turning the Tide, and it will be about the problem setting and some innovative approaches to combating plastic waste. I am very excited to see all of you here during this webinar, during this event. We have a full schedule, we have a full program, so please bear with us. I would like to start with introducing myself shortly. My name is Tom Vandermeulen. I'm the managing director of Control Union in the Philippines, and I'm also the chair at the Plastic Expert Group within Control Union. So within Control Union, we have a global plastic expert group, which I am the chair of. And within this, with this expert group, we are hosting a series of webinars that are aimed at informing our colleagues and our clients and our partners, our prospects, about plastics. How can we combat plastics? What do we need to do about the plastic issue? Because it is actually one of the biggest, maybe not even, maybe the biggest environmental issues that we are currently facing. So to do this, we have asked a series of, or a group of subject matter experts within the industry to be presenting their insights, to be presenting their developments so that you are up to speed on the latest innovations, the latest approaches to combat plastic waste. Because I think you all know we are living in an era, we are living in a world where more and more plastic waste is coming into our environments, and we need to do something about it. For the sake of ourselves, for the sake of nature, but also for the sake of our children, of course. So I'm very thankful that you are all here today. This webinar is recorded. We will have three speakers. Like I said, I will be moderating the webinar. We will have three speakers. I will be presenting and introducing them shortly. I will first start with the house rules of this webinar. It's a live webinar, meaning that only the presenters can unmute themselves and can unlock their cameras. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to do so through the chat box or the raising of your hand. I believe what I heard from the facilitator, Hill, all of you can raise your hand. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or ask it through the chat box, and then we can accommodate your, or the speaker can accommodate your question accordingly. Each speaker will be given approximately 20 minutes of time for their presentation. If there is time after the presentation, we'll be opening the floor for questions. But if there is no time left, then your questions will need to remain till the end of the webinar. As said, during the webinar, you can ask your questions during the in the chat box. We will try to answer those questions accordingly. Yeah, that's it. Those are the house rules. Let's get to the interesting stuff for now. Like I said, we have a very exciting and very sophisticated panel of speakers on this particular topic. We have three speakers, actually. The first one is Sarah Hately, who is the operations director at the Plastic Collective, who will be discussing about understanding the plastic crisis that we are currently in. Then the second speaker will be Oliver Cade, who is the CTO and the country manager for the UK at 7 Clean Seas. He will be discussing about innovative solutions to plastic waste. And then we have a third speaker, who is Maimouna Kante, who is the certifier for Vera's plastic waste reduction program, and who will be speaking about the insights on the validation and verification of Vera plastic waste reduction program. So very exciting topics. I am ready for it. I'm energized. I would like to first introduce you to our first speaker, who is Sarah from the Plastic Collective, who will be presenting a little bit on her insights. So Sarah is the operations director at the Plastic Collective. And she has worked closely with waste management projects to help them expand, attract funding, and to meet compliance requirements. Sarah also works with brands to help them develop and implement strategies to use plastic better. And Sarah is an experienced nonprofit leader, previously holding senior roles at large social and health service organizations in the US and in Europe. She started her career in the Australian Commonwealth Government working on climate change, renewable, and forestry policy. From there, Sarah moved into the management consulting and finance sectors, focusing on strategy, business acquisition, and development at Arthur Andersen, Henderson Investors, and Rothschild. Sarah holds a Master of Economics and a graduate diploma in environmental science from the Australian National University. She is a lover of all things outdoors, great books, and hopes to travel to Antarctica via the Drake Passage one day. So, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to see you again. I've seen you on some of the webinars already, but I would like to give the floor to you and welcome.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom, for that introduction. Much appreciated. And I'm going to dive straight in to define and discuss in a little more detail the nature and scope of the global plastic pollution crisis that we're presently facing. So let me share my screen. And we will be good to go. Okay, we can see that okay? Right, so I'm going to start by talking about the explosion in plastic production and plastic use over the last 70 years, how this has created this existential plastic pollution crisis, and then I'm going to dive into some of the details around the environmental, the health, and the social impacts. So to get things started, let's take a look at the global plastics market. So we are producing as a global industry about 410 billion tonnes of plastic every year, and that production figure is forecast to triple over by 2060. The value of that industry is around $590 billion. About half of that plastic is produced in Asia. In fact, 33% of that is produced in China. And crucially here, over 90% of plastic production is fossil fuel based. And what we're seeing at the moment is this shift in the face of the growing renewable energy market. The large oil companies are shifting out of more traditional oil refining activity and into plastic production, expanding their plastic production capacity. So if you look at just Asia, for example, about 80% of new oil refining capacity is targeted at plastics. And what's being produced by the industry? Well, about 40% of the outputs are packaging materials. The rest is materials for building construction industry, automotive industry, electronics, and consumer goods. So that's the supply side of the market. Let's take a look at the consumer side. So it is pretty fair to say that we are most definitely living in the plastics age. Plastic is ubiquitous, and it's also indispensable. And plastic consumption really has exploded since the post-war consumer boom of the 1950s. Let's take a little look at some of its important uses, which really drive from the fact that it's lightweight and durable. So this is a picture of the first ever plastic product produced back in 1862 by a person called Parks. It was called Park Line, and he made a fishing reel. So this is where our plastic consumer relationship started. And then fast forward multiple years, plastic is used prolifically in the aerospace industry. These are all just examples of use. So the plastic componentry in planes means that we can make larger planes, larger and lighter and more durable planes. Plane componentry. Plastic piping is absolutely essential to building water supply, particularly in emerging nations. Again, it's because it's a light and durable material. This is a picture of a medical implant, so a plastic composite hip joint. So the pink parts are actually made of plastic, again, because it's a durable and lightweight material. Tires are about 24% plastic, and we'll talk about the microplastic associated issue with tires in a bit. Clothing is over 60% made of plastic, and is probably the second largest use of plastic from an industrial perspective or industry perspective. And then here we've got our single-use plastics. These we'll look at these in a little more detail now, because the single-use plastics are one of the main causes of the plastic pollution crisis that we're facing, largely because they are thrown away and they degrade in the environment, and they seep into our soil, waterways, and even into the air in the form of microplastics. And then finally, just focusing here on the water sachets. So, and this is one of the huge sources of plastic, particularly in emerging countries, and those countries where there is not access to safe water supply. And so that if you look at a country like the Philippines, for example, there are around 60 billion water sachets consumed every year. So it's a very prolific use of plastic. That gives you a summary of the types of plastic we're using, and why it is so prolific in our society today. So what is the problem? So in a nutshell, the problem is that across its entire life cycle, plastic is entering our ecosystems. So what happens to plastic post-consumer? And we're talking about 360 million tonnes of plastic waste being generated each year. So if you break it down, 40% of that is being landfilled. So it's the most common end of life for plastic. It's not the best end of life, largely because the majority of landfills around the world are not what we call sanitary or engineered landfills. They're more like informal dump sites, which means that you have leakage issues into soil. They create fire hazards. They create air pollution. So poorly managed landfills are not an ideal end of life. Then 32% of our plastic is leaking directly into the environment. So it ends up on the streets, it ends up in our drains, and ultimately ends up in our waterways and in the ocean. 14% of post-consumer plastic waste is burned, and then just 10% is being recycled. So we've got very low levels of circularity in the plastics life cycle. It's more like a linear system. And this is the absolute crux of the problem. The fact that the that only 10% of our plastic is entering back into the system. And the reason for that, and again, this is the key to it all, is that there's a lack of waste management infrastructure to address this mismanaged plastic. And if you look at the research that's been done by Circulate Capital, they estimate that the infrastructure requirement to address to address mismanaged plastic and reduce it to 90% over the next 15 years is $15 trillion. So it's a huge infrastructure gap on a global basis that is driving this global plastic pollution crisis. And then, so that's the waste side of it. And then there's also the carbon footprint associated with the plastic life cycle. So about 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent is produced across the plastic life cycle, which is equivalent to about 100 the carbon footprint of about 190 coal-fired plants. So it also has a big climate impact. So you'll see here that I've got the geological eras here, and the reason for presenting this is to highlight the impact that plastic is having now from a geological perspective. So since the beginning of time, beginning of the planet 4.6 billion years ago, you look at our geological records, and we started around the Cambrian period. We've got beautiful trilobite fossils. We get to the Devonian period, and we've got fish and plant fossils, and the dinosaurs, obviously from Jurassic and the Triassic and Jurassic periods. But then we get to present time, and the deep footmark that or imprint that human activity is leaving on the planet is essentially in the form of plastic. So we are riddling our geological era with plastic, and hence the name Anthropocene. So let's dive a little further into the specific impacts of plastic from an environmental and health and social perspective. Environment, right. So let's start with oceans. And if you look at the pictures that we've got here on the right-hand side, the first one is the Pacific Ocean garbage patch. So this spans an area of about 1.6 million square kilometres. It's hard to get your head around something that's that enormous. It's about 3 times the size of France. It occurs in the Pacific Ocean because of the way the currents and the gyres move. So the gyres move, rotate against each other, cause a stagnated body of water, and the plastic, most of the waste in the garbage patch is plastic, accumulates there. Then the photo below here is of a ghost net, which is another significant impact of plastic on oceans. So that they're called ghost nets because when fishing gear is discarded in the ocean, deep oceans, they tangle up with each other. They can form these huge tangles that are kilometres long, and as you can see from this rather traumatic photo, ocean life gets trapped in it. They strangle and they die. And in addition to that, these ghost nets also can wash up on shore and destroy mangrove and other marine environments. So it's a huge problem. So in summary, the ocean impact is resulting from the entanglement and maiming of marine life. The other thing that's happening is that there's a breakdown of plastic when it enters the ocean into microplastic, and that's entering the food chains of marine life. And finally, plastic is also affecting the carbon sink capacity of the ocean. So in addition to the impact that it has on the ocean's ability to photosynthesize, there's also a release of methane from plastic as it breaks down and biodegrades in oceans. So not the happiest of stories there. It's not the next slide's not also not particularly happy, but let's persist. So the other environmental impacts are on air and soil, and these are less well understood, less well researched. But we certainly know that open burning of plastic releases black carbon and dioxins. We definitely know that air quality is significantly poorer around poorly managed landfills. In fact, I was in Accra about 2 weeks ago, visited my first ever landfill site, and it was quite the experience. Within half an hour, my eyes were streaming, my skin was itching, and you can see there's always smoking areas, or because it's the landfills emit methane and often catch that methane often catches fire. So poor air quality at landfill sites. In addition, airborne microplastics are also thought to cause positive net radiative forcing, which essentially means that the microplastic that's airborne in the environment is trapping more heat in the planet and causing it to warm further. In addition, there are some hydrofluorocarbons that are used in plastic production, but they are exempt from the Montreal Protocol, which is a ban on the protocol that bans the use of hydrofluorocarbons. So those are contributing to depletion of the ozone and to climate warming, climate change as well. And then finally, and this is early stage research, but there's the general indication is that plastic can also affect soil health and may be threatening our food production systems in the longer term. Then finally, or almost finally, health impact. This is probably my most negative slide. So let's push through it. So humans are ingesting the equivalent of one plastic credit card every week, which is not something to dwell on. And microplastics are entering the body, so through ingestion, through inhalation. There's even studies now that are suggesting that nanoparticles are entering the skin, through the skin. And microplastics are found in every bodily organ, in particular the brain, for some reason, has 20 times more plastic within it than other organs. And there's also some research that's recently been completed that suggests that the people who suffer from dementia have significantly more plastic in their brain. So, and the major contributor, or a major contributor to that microplastic is the textiles. So when we wash our clothes, they break down, they create microplastics, and they end up in the atmosphere. In addition, there's health impact from the 25% of the chemicals that are used in plastics that are of potential concern to human health. And these chemicals are linked to a multiple of number of serious disease. And then finally, the social impact of plastic pollution. So the top 10 plastic pollution hotspots in the world are all in the global south. The global north is exporting around 4 million tonnes of plastic to the south every year. And it's really the low-income populations that are bearing the brunt of plastic pollution. And again, this is because of minimal or no access to adequate waste management services. Also, these low-income populations tend to live closer to polluted areas and to landfills. And then when you look at the 20 million waste pickers around the world who are conducting around 60% of plastic waste management globally, these waste pickers are working in hazardous conditions for less than the living wage. And there's a huge stigma attached with the work that they're doing, and it's vital work. And the majority of the waste pickers are women. So these photos here on the right-hand side are some that we took when we went to Ghana a couple of weeks ago of our waste pickers, and when we were looking at the impact of some of our projects in terms of trying to improve social living conditions for waste pickers. And then the one on the bottom right-hand corner is one of our waste pickers in Indonesia. So, in summary, you could call the global plastic pollution crisis a wicked problem. And let me define that for you. So a wicked problem is one that is characterized by complexity, uncertainty. There are multiple potential solutions. A lot of them are very expensive. Often those solutions are competing. And there's a need for significant behaviour change to address them. So climate change is another example of a wicked problem. But here's the good news: we do have mechanisms to address these wicked problems, and one of the main ones is through multilateral environmental agreements. And these agreements can take multiple different forms, but most importantly, for the plastic pollution crisis is that there is the UN plastic treaty that's in the process of being negotiated. So the parties met for the first time in November 2022, and we are now poised to hold INC 5.2 at the end of July, and the hope is that this meeting will conclude with an agreed text for the plastic treaty. So there are still numerous outstanding areas to be negotiated, and these relate specifically to the target that may or may not be included in the text. So, and that's the target to reduce plastic production at a global level, the scope of the treaty, so to what extent will the life cycle of plastic be covered by the treaty. Other areas that are still being negotiated are the phasing out of harmful plastics and the elimination of chemicals of concern. And there's also negotiation ongoing around social inclusion, so the inclusion of waste pickers in the treaty, a just transition for emerging economies that have the largest problem in terms of waste management infrastructure, and how you finance that just transition. In addition, there's it still needs to be concluded how the parties to the treaty will report on their progress against their national targets. And there are a range of possible outcomes from INC 5.2. And these are driven by two parameters, really: ambition and consensus. So the more ambitious treaty that is aimed for in terms of scope and targets, the less likely we are to get consensus. So it may end up being a majority-based treaty, in which case it is potentially less effective because you don't have everybody agreed. Alternatively, we may end up with a less ambitious treaty, which is easier to achieve consensus on. So they're the two key parameters. But in any case, the most likely outcome is that this agreement will trigger a round or a series of COPs or conferences of the parties, where the details and minutiae of the treaty are hammered out. So, for example, extended producer responsibility is likely to be a core part of the treaty, or how countries can meet their obligations under the treaty, and so that will be one of the subject areas for the COPs going forward. But the word on the street is that a deal will be done at INC 5.2, so I'm very hopeful. And if it does happen at the end of July, it will be the fastest ever negotiated treaty. So that's good news. And I'm just going to finish on what I call the hope chart. So when you look at our history of negotiating climate MEAs, we've got much better at them. So the 1970s agreements, the CITES and the World Heritage Convention took about 15 years to get to the point of 100 signatories. But then if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, it was ratified first in 1998 and then only took 5 years to get to the point where there were over 100 signatories. And then the Paris Agreement was even quicker. So it received 121 ratifications in its first year. So he's hoping that the plastic treaty can better that. I'll finish there. Have we got time for questions?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for that quite dark and gloomy outlook on how we are doing with the plastic crisis. But I'm very grateful and very thankful that you ended off with some positive outlooks and some positive notes. And I think with any crisis, we need to first understand them to be able to tackle them. So thank you for sharing your important insights. For me, it was very confronting, but also very interesting to hear. We already passed the 20 minutes mark, so I would like to give the floor now to the next speaker already. And then at the end of the presentations, we can open the floor for questions. Like I said, you can also ask your questions as the workshop or the webinar goes on through the chat box. But thank you, Sarah. I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, who is Oliver Cade, who is a CTO and the country manager of the UK at 7 Clean Seas. He's going to talk about innovative solutions to plastic waste. So try to see how we can tackle this plastic. How can we avoid this plastic crisis from becoming worse? So Oliver Cade is the CTO and the country manager of the UK at 7 Clean Seas, where he leads innovation in the plastic credit market and develops scalable solutions to address plastic pollution. He pioneered the framework for scoping corporate plastic footprinting, which is now widely adopted by industry players such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Throughout his role, Oliver has helped shape industry standards and best practices, most notably advising on the inclusion of social safeguards for informal waste workers for the OPP social standard. Oliver's work bridges verified impact, inclusive design, and circular economy transitions, which is achieved through deep partnerships with governments, corporations, and standard setters like Vera. Oliver, thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to give the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, Sarah, for a great introduction to the plastic pollution crisis. And yeah, I'll jump right in. I'll try and keep it nice and short and cover as much of the solutions in key areas as possible. So I actually wanted to talk about really innovations in plastic pollution recovery, technology, policy, as well as kind of financing. And really, I think whenever we talk about solutions and innovations, the topic that comes to mind is always technology. right? So that's where I'll start, and particularly innovations in recycling technology. So I'm sure you've heard of some of these terms before: chemical recycling, advanced recycling. We're also seeing kind of biological and enzyme-based recycling. You might see in the news enzymes that are breaking down plastics, etc. And I just wanted to add a little bit more context to this. So when we talk about chemical recycling, we're really talking about taking some of the plastic products that we see, phone cases, plastic bottles, even difficult to recycle plastics like flexibles, and turn them back into their oil-based derivatives, the monomers, the polymers, and that's through processes like pyrolysis, etc. And the great part about chemical recycling is it means you can handle some of these more dirty plastics, recycle them, put them back into the market, and manufacture them into products that have the same quality as the existing plastics that we have. There's challenges with scales. We're seeing issues and innovations, particularly around enzyme-based recycling. It follows a similar approach to chemical recycling, but utilizing microbes and enzymes, which is really exciting. And one I also wanted to cover is compatibilizers. So mechanical recycling is the process of taking a lot of the products we have, shredding them and melting them back into essentially the beads that make up the products that we use. But some of the challenges we have is that no single plastic item is the same. It might have a PT logo or a HDPE logo on it, but the molecular structure may vary slightly. So having these things such as compatibilizers allow us to mix different variations of polymers and stabilize them, which means that we can boost mechanical recycling rates as well. So these are a couple of points on the recycling side. On the data and technology, I think that's important. It's impossible to have a webinar, a conference, a panel discussion without someone mentioning the term AI these days. But that's because it is sparking a lot of innovation across all industries. From the AI perspective, we're seeing smart sorting systems. So, when waste gets sent to materials recovery facilities, we're having AI tools and models which are identifying what plastics can be recycled versus what can't. We're seeing AI pollution monitoring systems using satellite imagery and drones, utilizing AI technology to map flows and movements of plastics across country boundaries, but also around pollution hotspots. But not AI driven, but definitely still data-based, is innovations in circular reporting systems. Actually, it's not just the AI and tech solutions, but having reporting systems for corporates, for governments, for waste management providers, for plastic pollution recovery projects is really flooding the market with innovative data, which is helping inform a lot of the decision making, which is happening at the International Conference of Parties to end plastic pollution, as Sarah kind of outlined. And then we also have innovations in plastic collection technology. This is typically river barrier led. I think it's well known that 70 to 80% of plastic that's in the ocean originates from the rivers through mismanaged waste, through rainfall events, makes its way into the rivers and then out into the ocean. So we're seeing all sorts of innovations in river plastic interception with barriers, with conveyor belts. The bubble barrier is one that's big in the Netherlands. Tom, I'm sure you've kind of heard of it. Essentially using bubbles to float plastic to the top of the water and then collect them. So we're seeing all sorts of innovations in that interception as well. This is one I just wanted to highlight, particularly on the AI satellite imagery to track plastic flows. So we partner with an organization called Plastic Eye. And essentially what they've done here for us is through our project locations in Bintan and Batam, they've mapped what you see in the red is clusters of plastic marine debris that are flowing between the Singapore Strait. So you can see when it's red, it's obviously in the ocean, and when it turns orange is where it lands ashore. So what you can see through this satellite imagery and AI is that we've been able to identify that a lot of the waste that's being produced around Indonesia is making its way to Singapore. It's making its way to Malaysia and also going all the way up east and all the way up west as well. Now, this kind of AI data technology and innovation is helping us work closer with governments in Singapore. It's helping us identify where we can start to target a lot of our collection. So you can see I'm overlaying just a snapshot of some of the activities we're doing to collect plastics over the AI imagery. And it really helps inform decision making. Because particularly in waste management, funding is constrained, and therefore what we need to do is make sure that every dollar spent on preventing plastic pollution is spent effectively. And I think that's where a lot of this data and innovation is really being utilized. But data and technology isn't necessarily the solution for every single challenge. Now, this is a photo taken from our project in Batam, and really the consequences of plastic pollution are very dire. And although, yes, a community like this can benefit from technology-based solutions, I would say that it's always about finding the local context and the right solution. And that's part of a wicked problem. It's about being very targeted with how we address certain challenges in certain areas and understanding the local context. And that's why, although innovations in AI, sorting, data, and whatnot are great for the global north, particularly in places like Indonesia, emerging economies, we need to focus on the basics. And those basics are really focusing on community-driven solutions. So the reason why I talk about community-driven solutions is because it has a host of social benefits as well, and also because we're dealing in cultural norms that are very different. Particularly if we're trying to go into really remote and island locations, we need to understand the cultural adaptation and respect for these communities. We need to understand how to develop projects that work for the communities, and also hire and support from the communities as well. And that's why I think community ownership is, I wouldn't say it's an innovation, but what I would say is that it's something that is becoming more prevalent if we're trying to tackle plastic pollution. Because if we want to do it effectively, we need to understand the local context, and that means bringing in the local communities into the process. Formal employment, as I mentioned, these communities that are quite heavily suffering from plastic pollution, they are largely informal, they're vulnerable and impoverished communities. So if we're able to build projects that can actually work on providing stable income, stable jobs, living wages and minimum wages for these communities, then we can start to focus on social protection and also inclusion. And that means uplifting a lot of these communities out of poverty, while also tackling the global plastic pollution crisis. And of course, education. Sarah mentioned that around about 45% of the globe's plastic waste management is not being conducted effectively. And that means that there's whole communities out there which don't even have waste management. So education and behavioral change is a fundamental part of building community-led solutions. However, we cannot talk about technology and innovation without talking about policy. And I think that really there's lots of great initiatives and innovations that's happening, but policy is really needed to harmonize a lot of that action. Now, Sarah already mentioned the Global Plastics Treaty, which obviously is in discussion, but I also wanted to cover the context of extended producer responsibility. Now, long story short, this is a policy initiative that's being implemented and growing traction or trending globally, which is essentially looking at shifting the burden of funding waste management away from taxpayers and government funding to the polluter pays principle, meaning that companies that are putting plastic on the market through packaging or products are now starting to pay taxes to then fund recycling and collection infrastructure in these countries. But it goes beyond that. We're also, EPR programs also look at mandatory packaging reporting so that we can understand the volumes and types of plastics that are flooding the market, setting recycled content targets to make sure that we're promoting the recycled feedstock and recycled plastic market, that we're adding labeling and tracking regulations. I'm sure you've heard of EU digital passports, which are now coming through in the coming years, that are starting to look at where products are manufactured, what packaging they're using, sustainability credentials, etc. And that helps with some of these sorting infrastructure and AI tools that we're also developing on a technological perspective. We're seeing deposit return systems. So essentially it's take back systems for plastic bottles, aluminum cans and other types of waste. We're seeing more of these taxes that are shifting to the polluter pays model, and of course harmonizing EPRs across regions. So we're seeing this across the EU, we're seeing across ASEAN, and really that's one of the key targets of the Global Plastic Treaty as well. So Sarah mentioned what the treaty's goals are and how we might end up with an ambitious target, or we might end up with a diluted agreement. And I wanted to cover some of the key points that are being discussed within the Global Plastics Treaty to give a little bit more context of how this could implement and drive policy innovation. So we are looking at the global UN agreement pushing countries worldwide that don't have extended producer responsibility systems to integrate national action plans and waste targets. We are seeing that we're starting to look at targeting problematic plastics. I'll give you an example: oxy-biodegradables. These are plastics that are degrade or deteriorate into microplastics at a faster rate. They're quite often used to mislead consumers on sustainability credentials of plastics. They've been widely banned across the EU for some years now, but they are still in use globally. So having a global treaty can help reduce some of these problematic plastics. It can also start to look at what financial mechanisms are available to start funding pollution prevention and recycling. And it can also start to look at how do we have global monitoring and verification protocols that are harmonized across all of the different countries as well. And importantly, the just transition. Sarah mentioned a lot about the social impacts of plastic pollution on the economy, on the environment and communities. And inherently, these two crises are linked. I always say the environmental crisis is a social crisis at heart. And if we try to address this, then we'll also be able to empower these communities to tackle the environmental challenges that they're facing as well. Now, I'll keep it short because I know that I would love to hand over to Maimouna, but one thing I really want to just cover before we do this is how do we pay for plastic waste management? Because this is a huge problem. 2.7 billion people worldwide don't have access to waste management, as Sarah kind of highlighted. And that means that 540 million tons of waste still remains uncollected. And that's not just plastic, that's waste as well. So the total funding gap estimated for waste management, and predominantly this is plastics, is around about 640 billion US dollars. And that's a huge amount of money that we need to cover. So is the treaty going to cover it? Are local governments going to cover it? Are polluters going to pay? How does that actually work? Well, there's a number of financially driven solutions to fund plastic pollution recovery and recycling. First and foremost, you have government funding through taxpayer or through EPR programs. I think these are two areas that are quite heavily dominating a lot of the funding for waste management currently. We're also seeing community-based funding, so household waste management fees. These are solutions that are being implemented across Indonesia, Southeast Asia, that the community start to fund the waste management service themselves. But of course, that isn't a solution for a lot of these impoverished communities. We're looking at the circularity-driven market. Of course, some plastics like PET bottles can be recycled and therefore they have a value. But if you look at that, even in large-scale waste management, for PET recycling, that only covers around about 30% of the long-going operational costs. And then we have innovative financing. So these are external innovations in financing through government grants, philanthropy, from even corporate sponsorship, but also a mechanism called plastic credits, which I wanted to introduce to also tee up the conversation for Maimouna. But essentially what we are talking here and what we're seeing more, I suppose, the growing demand and approach to address and fund plastic waste management is through blended financing, meaning that we're not dependent on just one single source of funding, because we ultimately want to be able to provide waste management indefinitely to these communities. And that means building diversity in how projects are funding and financing these initiatives. So quite often you'll see projects will have a different variation or mix in how they are tapping into financial solutions. And we need these financial mechanisms to provide the necessary funding and incentives for plastic waste management, because unfortunately the cost to generate the infrastructure as well as manage it is far larger than the value of the material in the process. And that's why we need blended financing. Now, I wanted to cover plastic credits because this is obviously one of the core innovations that we're seeing in innovative financing. But essentially, a credit represents a transferable unit and specific quantity of plastic that is either avoided from use, collected and managed, or recycled. And these credits can be sold as part of compliance mechanisms or part of voluntary mechanisms as a way of injecting funding into these projects which generate credits. That means that they can maintain their service of plastic waste management and also scale that approach as well. Currently, there are 198 projects worldwide that are utilizing this mechanism. And that's what we do here at 7 Clean Seas. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about us, but essentially we've built projects across Bintan, Batam, Indonesia, Bali, Bangkok, Thailand, essentially utilizing all of these different innovations in recycling, household waste management, river barriers, environmental collection, offshore collection. The key point is, as Sarah said, it's a wicked problem. Therefore, making sure whatever solution we provide meets the context of and the needs of the community that we're operating in. But utilizing innovations in plastic credits and innovative financing has been the mechanism that we've been able to draw investment into these projects. And also utilizing AI models and also tracking plastic flows to make sure that every dollar invested is invested wisely. And that's created a huge amount of impact for us. We've recovered over 5,200 tons of plastic, improved over 5,600 lives just last year from human health, infrastructure development, informal employment of over 106 waste workers. And ultimately, I think it's this impact that is really important, is putting the communities first as well. And it's also collecting a huge amount of plastic. But really what we're trying to see is through innovations in policy is to drive this market so that we can actually scale. So, our targets for 2030 are to recover over 100,000 tons worth of plastic. And I think that's the jump that's needed to start to make a real dent in the global plastic pollution crisis as well. So with that, I'd like to end my part of the webinar. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And for that, I'll hand over to Tom and Maimuna.
Wow, thank you so much, Oliver. That's very insightful and very helpful. So we have a lot of solutions, luckily, for this crisis. Technology solutions, community-based solutions, policy-based solutions, and finance-driven solutions. And I think the combination of those will probably be that's where we probably will find the best solution to this crisis. We can open shortly the floor to some questions. We have a couple of minutes. So I saw a raise of hands. I saw somebody raising a question already. Hill, can you maybe unmute the person? I think it was regarding EPR. What are the key success factors that have made EPR frameworks effective in leading countries, and how can these be realistically adopted to countries with less regulatory capacity or different market dynamics? Maybe Ollie, you can answer this one. Do you want to answer it now, or do you want to answer it through the chat?
Yeah, I can answer this now. And I'm sure Sarah could also jump in. So essentially, I think EPR has developed over the years, and I think it's constantly in evolution. What I would say is the most important thing that's required for an EPR program to work is accountability. And that means that companies that are regulated under EPR need to be able to be fined if they're found to be in non-compliance of the programs. And the reason why I say that is because in a lot of the countries worldwide, a lot of EPR law isn't enforceable. And therefore, that means that you only end up with, I suppose, companies that are focused on good intentions, but also global companies that can't be seen to not align with regional law to be in violation. But that's what we've seen. You see it all the time in all sorts of other policy and regulation. Apple or Microsoft, they might be infringement of a certain law and they get a fine, a slap on the wrist, and then ultimately a lot of that money then goes redirected into the policy's objectives. But what I would say is we need these checks and balances in order for it to work. And what we're seeing now in parts of Europe is that companies, the financial burden of EPR is so large that they are now being forced to look at alternatives. Even if those alternatives might be more costly, they're ultimately going to see a saving by adapting to the sustainability transition. So I think that's an important part.
Yeah, and
Sarah, would you like to shortly comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that EPR, in addition to the accountability factor that Ollie has outlined, for EPR to work, it needs three simple things. It needs a collection target contained in the legislation. It needs a recycling target contained in the legislation. And then it needs a PCA, a recycled content target. You don't have to introduce all those things at once. You do it in a phased manner. but they are the three core components to make EPR work.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's very helpful. Then, for time's sake, I would like to continue this webinar. Ollie, there's another question through the chat. Maybe during Maimuna's presentation, you can answer that one. And then at the later stage, we have a Q&A session where we can answer some of the other questions. But thank you so much, Ollie. Very insightful indeed. Now, I would like to give the floor to Maimuna, who is the certifier at Control Union for Vera's Plastic Waste Reduction Program. I would like to introduce Maimuna to you shortly before I hand over the floor to her. So Maimuna Kante works in sustainability certification, focusing on climate-related mechanisms such as carbon and plastic credits. At Control Union, she manages certification projects across multiple regions, supporting project developers, communities, and auditors in aligning with international standards. With a master's studies in resilient farming and food systems from the Wageningen University, Maimuna brings a strong interest in linking environmental integrity with practical community-level outcomes. Her work emphasizes cross-cultural coordination, knowledge sharing, and the role of certification in supporting sustainable development goals. Maimuna, I would like to give the floor to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Tom, and thank you to Sarah and Ollie for setting the scene for a lot of these regulations and the current plastic issues we have, and of course the innovations. As Tom has said, I will be giving insights on specifically validation and verification of Vera's plastic waste reduction program, which I believe has already been mentioned briefly. And as a member of the plastic program, as the member of the plastic expert group, and just my experience in the past couple of years, I'd like to give an overview of the objectives that we'll talk about, followed by the plastic programs that are currently offered at Control Union. And I will dive into some examples, two of our first plastic programs that we validated and verified a couple of years ago, and then we'll end with some key takeaways. And if there is time, some questions, but if not, those will be addressed during the Q&A. So for the objectives of this presentation, I'd like to give an overview of the plastics programs at CU. And so it would be different plastic programs focusing on the plastic credits related programs. And then we'll go into validation and verification. And then I will focus on Vera's plastic waste reduction program, what it is, and perhaps some similarities with other programs. And the two examples we'll look at would be one in Côte d'Ivoire and the other one in Thailand. So these are some of the projects that that are related to plastic that are currently on we certify or validate and verify. In total, 11 projects. Many of these have sub-programs and they will cater to specific needs. But in short, there is ocean-bound plastic certification, recycled claim standard. There is the global recycled standard. There is the recycled plastic certification. There's flex sticks. There is plastic waste reduction standard, which is Vera standard. There's the plastic pollution reduction. There's ICC Plus, RPM, plastic free certification, and community waste program. But like I said, we will specifically be focusing on Vera's plastic waste reduction program. I guess the first question is a short overview of who Vera is and why they are why they're related to the specific plastic program. And it's, as of now, it's the world's biggest standard owner of voluntary carbon offsets, and they're based in DC. They started out with verified carbon standards, and this essentially has many methodologies associated to it, but it ended up being the backbone of the plastic waste reduction program. And so the idea of plastic credits mirrors sort of carbon credits under the ISO 14064-3 regulation. So sort of the regulation that guides or that gives the guiding principles of how auditors and certifiers interact with the program. And to give you a brief overview of what exactly the plastic waste reduction program is without going into too much detail, it's a standard that is used for consistent accounting of crediting of a variety of plastics, focusing on collection and recycling activities. The plastic credit mechanism provides a means for financing activities that verifiably reduce plastic in the environment, as mentioned by Oliver. And this one mainly focuses on one part of the blending finance that was previously mentioned, so just the plastic crediting. Projects are audited by an independent third party and validation and verification body, such as Control Union, that is accredited under ISO 14065. And then under that, there's the 14064-3. And in terms of Control Union's specific services that we offer based on Vera's requirements, we will have 3 options, which is the validation service, the verification service, and the joint validation service. Joint validation and verification service. So the validation service would be for projects that are that have not started collecting yet, or would rather not go through with the verification quite yet. And in that case, then they would provide the VVB, in this case, Control Union, with a project description of their potential plans or plans that they are already performing. And the verification service, which would be the second service, is the service that looks at the activity that has already been done. So in this case, collection has already taken place, and in monitoring plan would be given to the validation and verification body. And the third service is a joint validation and verification service, which is oftentimes for projects that have already begun collection activities and they've been doing it for for quite some time already. And the idea is to give them a chance to not go through the step-by-step of the validation followed by the verification, since activity has already begun. And some of the examples that we'll be looking at, as I said, we'll look at an example in Côte d'Ivoire, which is Conceptos Plásticos. And it was via the Way Côte d'Ivoire project. And it is located mainly in the capital city, so in Abidjan. And this one, we performed a joint validation and verification and it was a collection program. And so in this specific example, this is Côte d'Ivoire, followed by some of the images from the collection activity of the women. Plastics that were collected were PET, HDPE, LDPE, PP, and different type of composite packaging. And this project is a plastic project, like it's a collection project engaging in several types of activities. The activity types in this project include manual plastic collection from the environment by the waste pickers and household plastic obtained from community members. The project does not generate waste for collection, which is an important part to mention. And it's by the association, the Bancadi Association, that collects plastic waste found on city streets. And they are mostly women. And this was mentioned by Sarah in the beginning of the presentation, that a lot of the waste pickers tend to be women. And in this case, also youth as well, hence the Way. And the second project that this was one of the second projects that we validated and verified. It was in Thailand, and it's it's called Second Life. And in this case, the type of plastic that was collected was PET, HDPE, PVC, LDPE, and different types of nylons and acrylic. And it was a collection and a recycling project. So both methodologies both modules or methodologies under Vera were addressed in this case. And here the idea was for Second Life to recycle ocean bound plastic and land plastic. And they were doing this through several ways by incentivizing the formal and informal waste collectors and recycling agents of islands and remote coastal areas, including municipalities, schools, and volunteers. They were connecting corporate partners with industrial recycling supply chains to ensure that the plastic would be reused and upcycled in an appropriate manner. And all of this, again, integrating into the local economy. They were investing in regional recycling initiatives to ensure that all the plastic would be disposed as well in an appropriate manner. And it was part of a larger project. And it was part of a larger project called the Pure Projet, and they focused on just plastic recovery and recycling, specifically through Second Life. And so some of the key takeaways that we can take from this is that there are many ways in which the plastic crisis can be addressed through various certification, validation, and verification programs. And Vera's plastic waste reduction standard is it's one of the ways in which this can be done. And it's a validation and verification process that provides accounting and crediting of a variety of plastic collection and recycling activities. And that marks the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maimouna, for sharing those insights and interesting projects in Côte d'Ivoire and Thailand. We have a couple more minutes for questions from the audience, if there's any. Let me see if there's any in the chat. Or if there's anyone who wants to ask a question, now is the time. Please raise your hand and we can give you the floor and we can unmute your mic and then you can ask your question to the respective subject matter experts in the panel. But very nice insights. If there are no questions from the audience, then I have a couple of questions in the meantime. Let me see if there's any raise of hands. I believe not, and I believe Oliver already addressed the other question in the chat. So then it's my turn to ask you some of the questions. So don't worry, I'll be gentle. I'll start with Sarah. Sarah, can you maybe elaborate that with your background spanning government, the finance sector, and nonprofits, how do you navigate in the complexity of scaling waste projects whilst also ensuring that they are in compliance with standards and requirements and the funding associated to it? So how do we scale waste projects? Sarah, would you like to take that one? Is it okay for you?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Yes, happy to take that. Thanks for the question. So in terms of scaling a project, you really need to involve all of the stakeholders from the very beginning. So that includes obviously the project. You need potentially the brands involved from a very early stage so that they can support through impact investment in the project. And crucially, you need the certification framework. So that's where Control Union comes in and other VVBs. So I'm going to talk about the example that's provided by the World Bank bond that we jointly released with the World Bank and Citibank in January 2024. And that was $100 million of financing that, and the coupon of that, around $15 million, went to two of our projects. So it was upfront cash, which enabled the two projects, one in Ghana and one in Indonesia, to scale up over a much shorter time and to a much higher degree than they would have ever otherwise been able to do. So it was that upfront cash injection that enabled that. And a critical ingredient to that was the certification of those projects under the Vera Plastic Waste Reduction Standards. So Maimouna has worked with us for about 2 years on certifying those two projects. So that has given us the compliance framework and the traceability and the accountability for those two projects, not just at the beginning of that bond, but for the lifetime of the bond. And in addition to the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard, the projects have been certified under the OBP, the Ocean Bound Plastic Collection and Recycling Standards. And most importantly, and I think this was an enormous positive of the bond, that the two projects are now compliant with the Social Plus standard, which means that the waste pickers, who are the core of these community-based projects, are brought along with on the journey with the projects and share in the benefits of the projects. So it's the combination of you need a scalable project to start with. You definitely need the financing. You need the brands to offtake the credits that are generated by the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard, and you also need that certification layer as well.
Thanks, Sarah, for that. And how would a project identify such a fund from either a government or a financial institution? How does a project identify this? Do they need to engage with a partner, or can they find it themselves on? Well, how does that typically work?
Yeah, it's not the easiest path. Most of the funding that goes to these community-based collection and recycling projects is through grants. This is part of the problem, that collection and recycling activity is inherently uneconomic, and to scale and to keep the project going on a sustainable long-term basis is a huge challenge. So the problem with grants is that they come and go. So you may end up with 2 or 3 years worth of funding, and then you have to renew or look for new sources. And so that's why we pin. We think that the Vera Plastic Waste Reduction Standard is crucial in providing finance to projects. So by certifying a project under the standard, you're able to generate a collection credit for every tonne of plastic that's collected, and a recycling credit for every tonne of plastic that is recycled. And by selling those credits, you're able to generate a long-term income stream for the projects. So that they're probably the two most available means for projects. A bond is a much bigger beast, and that it took us about 5 years to land that bond, and hopefully it'll get easier going forward, and that time frame will reduce. But generally, you need a financing partner to access that sort of financing. I don't know if Ollie, if you've got any further insights on that.
No, I think you've actually covered it quite nicely, Sarah. And I think a lot of it is the governance around the projects, and then it's the access to the financing.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I also see an interesting question popping up in the chat from Michelle. Is there a recognized methodology that allows the emission reduction that are achieved through plastic waste recovery to be quantified and potentially issued as carbon credits, in addition to the plastic credits? Ollie, do you want to take this one? I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, can I please take that? Because I think we actually get this a lot, and it's a really good question. So there are methodologies that have been developed in the back end, particularly with organizations like Climeco, to explore the co-benefit of carbon reductions and plastic reduction as well. The key challenge, though, is well, one, typical carbon models don't necessarily quantify the emissions of carbon from plastics in the environment, which is a challenge. And there's a lot of assumptions on, particularly per region, how much ends up in the environment, how much would have been openly burned, how much ends up in informal landfill. And particularly in areas like Indonesia and a lot of the global south, a lot of that data is quite difficult to find, which is a challenge. And to also highlight is that if you compare a carbon saving from a plastic recycling project or recovery project to, say, a reforestation project, the cost per ton of carbon saved is a lot higher when it comes to plastic waste management. So those, I think, are some of the key challenges in doing so, but there are methodologies available, and there is a co-benefit in a lot of projects as well. So it can be used as an additional revenue stream to continue to fund collection. And when we talk about initiatives like blended financing, then it really does start to come together. But I love this question because in theory, you can have, so one of our projects is in a marine protected area. In theory, you could have a full ecosystem restoration project which collects plastic from the environment, recycles it, generates carbon emission reductions through recycling, and also restores ecosystem service and quality through biodiversity. So you can build projects that cover biodiversity, carbon, plastics, all in one, and having methodologies that kind of combine all of these crediting systems together can be really impactful. Maimouna, I know you kind of work on the carbon and the certification side of everything. So is there anything else that you think could be relevant?
Yeah, no, thank you for that response. I think that's very relevant. And I think the key is definitely how you, your last point about how you built the project. We recently had a recycling project in Turkey that applied for both Vera's plastic program and Vera's carbon program. And so in doing so, then they were able to access both carbon credits. Well, they will be able to access both carbon credits and plastic credits. So it really comes down to how you built the project and how you, yeah, I don't know about one specific methodology, but I know that you can combine methodologies.
Okay, thank you, Maimouna, and thank you, Ollie. That's much appreciated. I see another question popping up. How do you successfully integrate informal waste sectors into the formal system? And what lessons can be applied to emerging economies like Indonesia? Maybe Ollie or Oliver, maybe you want to take this one, as you are active or your company is active in most of these economies already.
Yeah, that is a really great question and a really difficult challenge, actually. When we originally started building our projects, we had a goal to hire 100% from the informal sector. The challenge that you have is that with the informal sector, you quite often have indentured labor, which means that quite often funding is provided to the waste pickers to, for example, send their kids through to school, to pay healthcare bills, and then essentially the initiatives through informal waste collection is used to pay back that debt. It's really sad, actually. Indentured labor is identified by the UN as modern slavery, which is really sad. But that causes a lot of challenges. In those circumstances, sometimes you can offer to pay off the debts and kind of wipe it as a clean slate if they're willing to kind of join the organization. There is also issues, particularly on flexibility. A lot of informal waste workers, as mentioned by kind of Sarah and Maimouna, in some cases are women, and therefore you have children that particularly in terms of in places like Indonesia, family household structures, you then have to start to think about, well, how do you start to care for the families? So making daycare centers and funding them within the projects can also be a way to encourage informal waste workers to come on board. But in some cases, everyone does have free will. In some cases, unfortunately, people don't want to be in that informal system, and actually don't want to kind of work to formal structures. And what we'd always say is that it's important to not proliferate the informal sector, because we don't want to proliferate the social challenge. But it's also important to not take away from the informal sector, because these communities are dependent on these livelihoods to feed their families and loved ones as well. So I think it's about working with and supporting people that want to make that transition, but if not, then making sure that they are still protected as well. Obviously, 7 Clean Seas, we formally employ all of our waste pickers, but a lot of them come from the communities themselves, so they have a range of backgrounds, fishermen, farmers, etc. as well.
Very interesting, Ollie. Thanks for sharing it. Maimouna, maybe how do standards or how do scheme owners deal with that kind of, complexity with regards to the social aspect and the informal and the formal? How does Vera deal with that in their program? What do they specify with regards to, does there need to be a contract with the collector in place? Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you for the follow-up question. Indeed, there's a section that specifies within the standard the need for just clarity, that the auditor needs to have clarity on how the workers are either hired, and so we ask to see contracts. We try to, oftentimes the contracts are in a different language, but then we need the translation version of that contract to make sure that there are clear alignments with the labor laws of that country to the contract that is provided. So yeah, in general, we check contracts, labor laws, and all of those go into validating and making sure that we can confidently state that the project is not violating any laws.
And I think if I'm not mistaken, I think most of the international certification schemes currently already include social additionality, and this is one of the main aspects actually. How do you ensure that the informal waste collectors are not not benefiting from the projects that are being implemented? Ollie, I see you raise your hand again. Go ahead.
I think it's an important one. We've briefly touched on it, but there is a standard called the OBP Social Plus standard, and Control Union obviously are auditing bodies of the standard. But what that does is doesn't necessarily require projects to formally employ waste workers, but what it does look to make sure that projects that are utilizing waste collectors, that those waste collectors have the same, I suppose, employee benefits as you would formal employment. So this standard actually helps as a stepping stone. So you can work with informal workers, elevate how the working conditions, how they're being monitored, making sure that there's no child labor, right, that they have access to rights and representation, that they have empowerment, correct compensation, all of these things which are a step towards. And then suddenly that step from, okay, well, we've uplifted the informal sector, now why don't we just formalize them, is a very small jump. So I think that there are mechanisms in place that are trying to explore this as well.
Very good. We're nearing almost the end of this webinar, but we've had very important and nice insights into some of the projects, into some of the developments, into the crisis itself. We had a very good setting of the scene by Sarah. Then Oliver went into some of the solutions. They can be technology driven, they can be community driven. And then Maimouna had an excellent presentation on how Vera, as an example, a certification scheme can help projects to become certified and to enable maybe funding and to enable partnership with brands. So I think for me personally, it was a very interesting webinar. I would like to thank all the speakers on behalf of all of us and on behalf of Control Union and the Plastic Expert Group for your important insights and your valuable contributions. Our facilitator, my colleague Hill, is going to share a form, I think a Microsoft form, through the chat of this webinar that you can fill in a feedback form. Did you enjoy it? Would you like to participate in the next one? Because this is the first webinar in a series of 3 this year. So we are very thankful for getting the expertise of these subject matter experts. So Sarah, Ollie, Maimuna, thank you so much for sharing and taking the time to be with us today. I really learned a lot, honestly, and I really appreciate your inputs. So thanks. I wish you a lovely morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. I see a couple of questions in the chat still. We will be answering those, and we will be following up with each one of you because you filled in the form. We have your details, so if you want us to engage with you, reach out to us for any questions that you have. And we will also be sharing, if we can, Ollie, Sarah, can we share your presentations with those present here today? And
Yeah.
Maimuna? Yeah? Okay, so we will also be sharing those presentations. So yeah, like us, follow us, try to keep engaged because we have the next webinar. We anticipate the next webinar to be somewhere in September. So thanks everyone, and I wish you a lovely day and evening. Thanks to the speakers as well, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.